Hello, fellow minds. Thank you for continuing to watch the Amoral Philosopher blog. I hope you're all staying well. This is our fourth episode on the topic of discrimination. Last time we discussed the case of an airline that is trying to charge obese people extra. And I suggested to you that it may be the case that whether we judge the case of discrimination as wrongful or permissible depends on the priority that we assign to certain competing values and considerations. Now, some of you may be convinced, others may not be, and you may say that perhaps it's plausible to think of discrimination, of wrongfulness of discrimination in this way, in the airline case, but when we look at other paradigmatic cases of discrimination, where discrimination is clearly wrongful, that doesn't sound right. So, to try to convince you to look at it this way, today I'm going to give you a different case. As I'm recording this video, the world is continuing to live through the COVID-19 or the coronavirus crisis, and the healthcare systems around the globe have been um, hit by the crisis in a sense that they're not prepared. The medical resources are scarce, and doctors around the world have to make decisions as to uh, which people are going to get care and which are not going to be treated. Now, ethical committees and medical associations around the globe have issued various ethical guidelines um, to try and guide doctors in this difficult decision making processes. Now, as I'm recording this in London, the British Medical Association has followed suit and issued similar guidelines. According to the BMA guidelines, the priority will be given to those patients who have the highest chances of survival, basically. I quote, whose conditions are the most urgent, the least complex, and who are likely to live the longest. And the ethical guidelines say that these priorities will be followed, even if that would mean discontinuing treatment of other patients who are already being treated. Now, the reasoning behind this is the following. The idea is that if someone has a pre-existing health condition, uh, they may be high maintenance, and they may take longer to get cured, and they would require a larger share of medical resources, which in turn would mean that other people will not be treated in the meantime because they would not be getting access to the intensive care units or the lung ventilator machines or medical personnel that would be treating these high maintenance patients. Uh, so this priority in turn would mean that some people will be effectively left to die. It's an unfortunate decision, but that's the decision that the ethics committee of the BMA is recommending the doctors to take. And the thinking here is utilitarian, that we have to be saving more lives. And if this means that people who have lower chance of survival would be left to die, well, that's the consequences we have to bear. Now, the BMA admits that this policy will inevitably be indirectly discriminatory against both the elderly and those with long-term health conditions who may be denied access to the life-saving resources. However, they believe it would be lawful under the UK Equalities Act because it would amount to a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. The reason the BMA want to stress that this discrimination is indirect is because direct discrimination cannot be justified under the UK Equalities Act, and the cases of indirect discrimination can be justified by reference to being a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. Now, it is debated how to draw the distinction between cases of direct and indirect discrimination. In the US, for instance, there is a concept of disparate treatment and disparate effect. The difference between those is that if someone is accorded disparate treatment, it usually involves intentional use of protected characteristics such as race. And indirect discrimination is usually when there is a disparate effect that may not have been aimed at, but is a result or a systematic consequence of a certain policy. Um, the US courts treat the difference between disparate treatment and disparate effect, or the direct and the indirect discrimination, as a difference of a kind, while the UK courts see it as a difference in degree of comparative impact on a protected group. Now, as I said, the reason why the BMA want to stress that this will be a case of indirect discrimination is clear, because they want to say that the discrimination in this case is justified. And the standard of justification is just being a proportionate means to achieving a legitimate aim. Now, whether the suggested policy legally qualifies as direct or indirect discrimination can be questionable, because after all, the BMA guidelines expressly invoke such protected characteristics as the age of the person as one of the criteria for decision making, and they also invoke the pre-existing conditions, which could hint at the protected characteristic of disability. But leaving that aside, whether the suggested policy here is legally qualifies as direct or indirect discrimination, we're concerned not with the legality of these measures, but with them being judged morally permissible or not. Now, given the existing legal standard of justifying indirect discrimination, it has been suggested by some authors that perhaps the indirect discrimination is also morally wrong when it's not justifiable by reference to being a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. And so it can either be that there is no legitimate aim, or the means of achieving it is not proportionate. Perhaps given the vagueness of the distinction between direct and indirect discrimination, we could actually use this criterion of moral wrongfulness and extend it also to cases of direct discrimination, allowing us to build some unified concept of moral wrongfulness of discrimination. Now, what the COVID-19 medical discrimination case that we just discussed demonstrates is that the question of discrimination's permissibility hinges on our judgment of whether this case of discrimination is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. The aim here is noble, obviously, saving more lives. But it may be that, as the chair of the British Medical Association's Medical Ethics Committee has put it, I quote, "It may be the case that the principle that everyone matters is in tension with the requirements to maximize overall benefit." Now, this can be a case of classic clash of deontological and utilitarian principles. More generally, perhaps, when we are speaking of legitimate aims and proportionate means, it seems that we're speaking of balancing different values or considerations against each other, of trying to compare them. The legal account speaks of justifying discrimination in terms of proportionality or legitimacy, but it seems that what we do when we justify the negative effect is assign more weight to some considerations. So I think that it may be that whether discrimination based on a particular trait in a given circumstance is wrongful or permissible is relativized to the chosen priorities between various considerations that may come into clash. So that discrimination is permissible when we find it that the considerations in favor of discriminating overweigh. When we find that the considerations in favor of discriminating are overweighing, and otherwise it is wrongful. Now, I'll leave you to think about this example, and as always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the comments to this video, and I'll see you next time. Stay well.